was recently told by a relative a story about my childhood that I did not know. When I was about 4 years old, our family was driving next to this remarkable building in Milan where we lived at the time. And I was sitting in the back seat of the car, and so looking outside, I just said, wow, what is that? And I was told, it's a cathedral. And I said, well, after a moment of silence, which apparently was notable, who builds cathedrals? And I was told architects and engineers. And apparently that was the first time that I produced an announcement to my family that I would want to become an architect and engineer one day. And since then, I never questioned it, and it's sort of been that way. But I didn't go on to build cathedrals, nor has my journey into the design world been that predetermined. One thing I knew was that I always wanted to build, and that I outgrew Legos very, very quickly, and that I moved on to building structures in the garden with coat hangers and extension cords and electrical tape and my mom's shoes and things that I wasn't supposed to use. And also that I was fascinated by technology, which basically meant that anything that had an on and off button I had to take apart. It was fair game. So to my father's exasperation, televisions, radios, hair dryers, electrical outlets, all these kinds of things, computers obviously, they were just my toys. And that granted me the nickname of MacGyver eventually for my family, very endearing. But when my skills were not so developed, I actually was systematically banned from any electrical appliance in the house. So I want to tell a story about this journey around building and technology, which has been my journey in many ways. And specifically, I want to talk about how technology changes the way in which we build our physical worlds. And in so many ways, how sometimes that leads to breakthrough and innovation. So when you look at this building, if you know how to read it, and in Italy growing up there, you become quite versed in reading the buildings because they tell you incredible stories. You actually would see a great breakthrough in innovation that revolutionized the building industry at the time. It was the vaulted, actually, arches, the Gothic arches, which meant that ceilings could be really high, which meant that walls didn't have to load bear, which you could punch enormous holes through the walls. And then a new form of art, an art form of storytelling through stained glass was born. And what's important about that was that also many jobs were born, many startup builder companies, and many of these skilled technical workers of the time that would go from project to project throughout different cities in Europe. So you see, the built environment is and has always been an enabler of human endeavor and also a reflection of human endeavor. So the question I've been wrestling with for a while and I've been asking myself is, how does our tech generation that is so invested in building incredible digital spaces actually build the physical world around us? So when I started getting serious about building and hanging out with other MacGyver types, my studies led me to research what I think is one of the most incredible building explorations of our time in the 20th century. But like any other human enterprise that expands our mind and our frontiers into new horizons, things like this take a long time, and it also take many people. The cathedral that I showed you before started in 1386, and the last door was hung and constructed in 1966. So it took 600 years to be built, 200 to be used. By that time, space exploration programs were well underway in different countries, to give you an idea of how this changes. And by 1998, the first two modules of this habitat were joined, and since 2000, astronauts have been living there. This is, in fact, an inhabited lab above low Earth orbit. The complexity, technically, of these environments from an engineering perspective is actually quite high. In my research, I call them networked environments because they're very much built like a network of systems habitation engineering. But when you spend some time studying these spaces, you actually realize that there's another factor, another variable that's just as complex. And engineers like to call these guys human factors, the astronauts, AKA. So these guys, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, women and men alike. They have different cultural backgrounds, psychological needs. They need to stay engaged. They need to stay inspired. They actually, most importantly, have to be productive. They have to be healthy and productive. And by all accounts, is a very unusual work and living condition. But these users are not ordinary people. In this context, are not ordinary in many ways. And so what you see, the research shows you, is that these types of habitats are actually really, really like high energy. They're busy. People are always connected to technology and to data and to mission control, of course. And time was really fast. Their day was really fast. And That goes beyond the fact that they, on average, see 15 sunrises and 15 sunsets in 24 hours. The point here is that there's something that happens in these kinds of spaces, and this is the beginning of some of the insights that is really the reason why I study places like this, because I think they tell you something about the future. They have a different design DNA, so to speak. And when you see places like this, what you start learning is that when we spend most of our lives in spaces that are basically technology spaces, whether it's the hardware around them, like what we saw before, or even when we spend too much time online, too much time in digital space, our perception of time changes. And we begin to acquire the sensibility of the clock speed of technology, which moves a lot faster than we do. We actually begin to crave that speed. We desire it in many ways. We become comfortable with it. And another thing that you learn in studying these high-tech habitats is that there's two ways to build. When these technologies are introduced, you definitely want to ensure the crew's survival. But when you become used to living in these foreign spaces, all this stuff of life sort of emerges. And in engineering, as well as in life, survival and living are two very different considerations. One is about preserving the variables that we know, the things that we know. The other one is about being open to exploring the unknown, really unlocking creativity, and in many ways, having the autonomy to make decisions. So for me, it was really not surprising to find similar types of behaviors in a project that I was working with in 2006, 2008, because these are variables that are not, they're space agnostics, they're human factor variables. So this is an R&D lab, which was an engineering library in a college campus. And it was built in a way, and I won't go into the technology details, to allow the end user to actually program their space. Students could move outlets, they could move lights, sensors, actuators, projectors, move walls, move furniture. And what's amazing, basically, is that they could co-design together their experiences. But what's even more amazing is that it was very effortless for them to do this. At the time, these types of environments were not very common, I can assure you. But the thing is that these students had learned how to interact with each other, how to collaborate, how to solve problems, how to study in digital space. So to find themselves in a physical environment that reflected this type of capability was actually effortless. It was quite easy, which is not surprising then for me to see that as these students graduated, these are people that would be in their mid to late 20s to early 30s right now. A lot of them chose to build their social and their professional networks in startup spaces, hacker spaces, jellies, meetups, or global co-working network, co-working spaces, which are a community-based type workspace that started in 2006 and by 2010 looked like something like this around the world. So why is all of this important at the end of the day? To me, it's really, really important. And one of the reasons is not only because of what these figures tell you, the sheer amount of square footage that we build of commercial real estate, but because there aren't many businesses in the United States that are not involved in some way into the production, the making, the operation, the design of the building, of the built environment. We even measure productivity, for example, of retail spaces in dollars of sales per square foot. We're always engaged in building our world around us in one way or another. But the problem is that what these numbers don't tell you, which were taken in 2006, is that we also spent $544 billion in commercial construction projects 2 years before the crash. And the research tells you that up to 57% of the current existing building models have no value added, basically waste in the system itself. It's the equivalent of saying that the way we build our homes, our schools, our healthcare facilities, our offices, certainly, only works 40% of the time. And so what happens then is something like this, which has its role to play in the construction industry. But this is really economically compelling. And it's not surprising, obviously the economics of 2008 prove it, that something like this happens. But I, for one, refuse to believe, actually I don't want to believe, that this is the only viable economic option that we have to think about the future. So for me, the question still remains, even though this is the reality that we live in right now. How are we, digital change agents of our time, building the physical world around us for the generations that will follow? And granted, this is a very complex problem. This is something that, again, requires many people and a long time. But I think it's one of those things that is difficult to understand because we're in it right now. So we don't have that critical distance to know what is really happening and how do we do that. To me, however, even though the problem is really complex, is the types of problems that usually are very interesting to me, there's always that DNA of the solution sometimes in it. You just have to know how to see it. You have to know how to read it. And nowhere was this more evident to me than in the sort of last chapter of my journey that I will share today, which began with me giving a talk, similarly to today, talking about these tech spaces and startup spaces and co-working and whatnot. And then finding myself having an interesting conversation, a very serious one, with this lovely view of downtown Las Vegas. And realizing that my host had asked me to come to Vegas. He's a local business leader, personally very invested into the redevelopment of downtown. He was at the talk that I was given, he was in the audience, and he asked me to come to Vegas, which I visited for the first time, to help him and his team catalyze some of these high-tech spaces, these startup spaces, co-working spaces. So you see, for the first time in my life, when I was looking out this window, actually, besides the fact that it really made me scratch my head, I felt for a moment, how do I say this? What you feel when you know that something's about to hit you that's going to rock your world. And I think saying that I was a bit scared of the project is an overstatement. But I think a healthy level of caution and intimidation was definitely a thing. See, the thing was, for me, this wasn't the scale of this project, the ambition of it, or even the technical complexity of it, or whether I felt like I could manage my part of it or not. None of that was a problem. It was the type of complexity that I had not been exposed to before, because this was all about human factors. My engineer friends would have run for the hills. This was really about a community, about their neighborhood, their lives, their stories, their aspirations, what inspired them, what they wanted to build for their children. And that kind of stuff, the stuff of life, was inevitably going to get mixed into the project if I started working in this, which basically meant that this was going to become personal really quickly. And it wasn't just going to be personal for me, for them, it was going to be personal for me. Because I had to admit to myself that it's exactly this kind of stuff, the stuff of life, that is the reason why I embarked on the journey to become a builder and to learn about the built environment. Because I think it's so important, even as digitally wired as I am, because we live our lives in it. And we shape our buildings, and then eventually they shape us. So for me, this quote was one of those that I always sort of put up, an engineering quote. And it actually was applicable at the time. And as any incredible experience or an experience worth living, my time in Las Vegas was a time of great challenges, but also incredible rewards, great complexity. And I had the opportunity to spend 11 months in Las Vegas to share my knowledge on systems engineering and design with an incredible emerging community of local community champions. I also had the privilege to share knowledge on co-design and watch them design, co-design together, one little community project at the time, the world around them, the buildings around them, not necessarily, but really the world. And what the outcome of this, what I initially thought and was asked to do, would have been the precursor of community tech spaces and workspaces, actually was something that for me was new, but it was bigger. It was something better in a sense, which is it's physical, digital, civic space. It was something that's much broader than any one building. And so these are the kinds of things that I learned, which are insights that I think tell us something about the future. That if you share your knowledge freely within your community or within your network, and more people do this, over time you build resilience in the network, which is an engineering term to simply say that people in that community can face change and challenges better, and that they will be sustainable over time in ways that they couldn't otherwise. And that if you see your neighbors as co-designers of the spaces that you inhabit and that you're building together, all of a sudden what that unlocks is empathy. And your communities are better and they will grow as a result of it because you see them and they see you in a totally different light. And another thing, which is actually important, that if you continue to share that intelligence, if you maximize it to as many stakeholders as you can, very quickly you maximize your potential for meaningful innovation. And what that meant for me was that is the type of innovation, the real breakthroughs, that not only shift your perception about your neighborhoods and your cities and your communities, but they shift the perception of yourself as a change agent in those contexts. So, when you see something like this, as I did, you're no longer surprised when you realize that even a very small community endeavor like this all of a sudden materialized in people wanting to tackle something like demonstrating to the world that you could build a greener, better community green block experience in the middle of the desert, or that an empty parking lot, an empty store would be a great place to meditate and to celebrate health and wellness and to do so all together. And so you see, these types of things, I wonder, I don't have the answer, if there's sort of like a 21st century version of those stained glass craftsmen that I talked about in the cathedral. This new opportunity that unlocks when technology innovation changes our lives, it changes the way we interact with each other, the way we build things together, and opens up this whole new world of opportunity. I don't have the answer for that. I think this is still too early. It's still certainly very close for me, so I may not be as objective as I usually am. But I do think that the design DNA in little projects like this, community projects, definitely tell us something about what it would be like for us to build for the future. And I think that that's a story we're sharing about Las Vegas. Thank you.